Okay, apparently there's no issue starting, so let me introduce you. So to my viewers who are hopefully here, I'm Dr. Pete, and I'm part of the Dr. Pete and T team. And for today, we have with us Dr. Richard Johnson, and I want to go ahead and introduce him quickly. And I actually put a flow chart up on the wall for this because I actually don't want to get this stuff right, or wrong. So I'm going to stand up for a second. Uh, Dr. Richard Johnson is a Tomas Barrel Professor of Medicine at University of Colorado, Denver. He and I have in common that I did my graduate work in Colorado at University in Boulder. He's a kidney specialist. Guy, I need to point this out. I was having a conversation yesterday with somebody, and this guy is a clinician and a researcher, right? He's not have his feet in just one area. And I'm going to come back to that concept in a minute. He's published hundreds of papers, and I can attest to this because I've been immersed in his work now for months. And in addition to that, he's published a number of books, the Sugar Fix, the Fat Switch, and we have a book coming out will it be December?
February 8th.
February 8th, called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. I have read the Fat Switch, and Dr. Johnson was kind enough to send me an advanced PDF of Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. And for all of you guys that are out there, if you're reversing chronic disease, if you're one of the people that works with me, or you're like me and you're in the middle of this business, we're between the science and trying to help the people that need it, you should read these books because they are fantastic. Now, there's two things that I want to tell our listeners about today that I feel super strong about. And when I first got into this business, reversing my own diabetes and putting my gout in remission, I was super concerned about actually being able to find real science that said something that you could learn about these conditions so that you could act intelligently about trying to change the way that we eat so that we could recover from these chronic diseases. And so I'm going to read three things that I've written with a lot of thought about Dr. Johnson earlier this morning. The first is that I think that Johnson's work over the last decades has been seminal to understanding the causative factors behind type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and I'm going to add gout to that because was on my end list for trying to sort out in regard to myself and now the people that I health coach in that regard. His hypothesis, which is the fructose uric acid model of type 2 diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease, is a central explanation for this. His work is seminal, it's groundbreaking, and is fundamental to understanding actually insulin resistance. And if it was up to me, which it's not, but if it was, I would have him on a list for the Nobel Prize for this work because it's so fundamental and groundbreaking and behind the issues of chronic disease that we're faced with now in our society. And lastly, I'd like to say his work is global in nature. And this is the key thing. This was one of the fantastic things that impacted me in my own training at Boulder, was the global nature when we're trying to answer a question, reaching across disciplines and taking what those guys know and integrating it in order to find the solution to a problem. If anything, this guy is an example of someone who does not live in a hallway.
Thank you for such kind words. I feel embarrassed to proceed, but I'm really thank you for those very kind words. We do take a multi-pronged approach to trying to understand this whole problem, and I do think that combining different fields is very useful. And the trick is to work with experts from each of the fields so that you're not like dilly-dallying, and but you're actually really get immersed in the science from multiple angles. So thank you.
We're going to have Scott join us. He's going to hold off. Whoops, sorry, I keep messing up. He's going to hold off his questions till the end, and then we'll give him a chance to hopefully, get one question in there. So
Great.
So here's what I want to start with. When pretty much, and here's what I'm worried about in the field that I'm in, right? Because I consider myself a logistician between the guys like you with the science and then the people that are suffering that I can help with from a health coach point of view. Because I can say, okay, here's what the science says, here's what you can do. One of the things that I worry about in my own field is that we're in a hallway. And one of the arguments that I hear out there when we talk about insulin resistance is that, all right, you're having this meal, it's hyperglycemic, there's a lot of glucose, therefore the insulin goes up, and now you're going to have the insulin resistance because there's so much insulin going around, and that's what's driving all this. And I wanted to ask you first, I know I've heard you talk about this in some of the YouTube that I've watched and also in your papers, but what's your view? What's driving insulin resistance?
Yeah, so first off, insulin resistance refers to a state in which you have reduced ability to take glucose up into your muscle, your liver, and your fat. And normally glucose is the main carbohydrate fuel that the tissues use. And so what happens is when you become insulin resistant, it takes more insulin to get that glucose into the muscle, the liver, and the fat. And as a result, insulin levels go up. And in order to do that, and you tend to have higher glucose levels, often the fasting glucose level is a little high. And as the insulin resistance continues over time, it can degenerate into type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is a condition where insulin resistance is very profound. And then at some point, the pancreas can't keep up with producing enough insulin. And then at that point, the glucose goes sky high and you get in the blood and you get diabetes. So that, first off, that's the definition of insulin resistance. And it was discovered a long time ago that people with obesity tend to be insulin resistant, and that insulin resistance is often a precursor to diabetes, to hypertension, to heart disease, and to many other conditions. And so it was long thought that insulin resistance is obviously a bad guy, and that that insulin resistance is really at the core of what's causing most medical complications related to obesity. And the endocrinology world particularly focus on insulin resistance as being at the core of everything. Our work kind of shed a different light on this. So we realized that animals in the wild often go through periods where they want to gain weight dramatically in order to get enough fat to survive periods of time when there's not much food around. The classic, of course, is the hibernating animal, right? The bear that will gain a lot of fat in the fall in order to prepare for a period where there's food shortage. And also, when animals are starving, they will also activate everything they can to forage for food, and they get hunger and thirst, and they go out and try to get food. And in both conditions, the starving animal and the animal preparing for a period of food shortage, in both situations, these animals become insulin resistant during the time that they're trying to put on fat. And what we've learned is that that fat is a survival response for these animals in the fall, that they're putting on fat so that they can survive the winter. And insulin resistance is actually a survival response as well. And what that is what I mean by that is that, if you don't have enough food, you want to have at least enough. You want to have enough calories to keep your brain operating, because if you can't think, you're basically going to die. And survival requires an operating mind, even more so than fuel for your liver, your muscle, and your fat. What you really need in a starving situation is to be alert enough that you can forage and find food. And what insulin resistance does is it preserves the glucose for the brain. So by reducing the amount going into the muscle, it actually helps basically shunt the fuel from the tissues to the brain. And so insulin resistance is actually, and fat actually represent nature's survival response. And in starvation, you become insulin resistant to survive. But if you're preparing for a period of food shortage, you also activate those same pathways, preserve the fuel for the brain, start storing fat, et cetera. And so that's what the hibernating animal does. Now, when we were studying this, and we did study hibernating animals, but we also studied animals in the laboratory animals. So we did classic biology. What we found was that there was a particular food that was really dramatic at activating this pathway. And it was fructose. And fructose is a sugar. It's present in fruit, which we think of as healthy. But it's, and fruits are healthy. We should talk about that at some point. But anyway, the fructose, when you give it to an animal, they become insulin resistant. They start accumulating fat. And in a long story, we did many, many studies, and we came to the conclusion that fructose was the primary driver of this response, and that it wasn't always from fructose that we ate, but it could also be from fructose that our body makes. And this was kind of a big breakthrough to realize that there is a sugar that seems to particularly drive this response. And, fructose, the main source of it today is not fruit. The main source out there is sugar. And table sugar is also known as sucrose, which is a disaccharide. It's a sugar that has two sugar molecules bound together. That's why it's called disaccharide. And one of them is fructose, and one is glucose, and they're bound together. And when you eat them, they break apart, and you get a fructose load. And high fructose corn syrup is the other big culprit. Culprit's probably the right word. It's the other guy that has a lot of fructose. And together we call these added sugars, high fructose corn syrup and table sugar. And they amount to the primary drivers of this response. Is that, I'll stop there and let you continue to ask questions.
Well, so that was really, really good. So so I have so much stuff. I'm sorry if it sounds like I don't have a question. I actually have a million of them. So let's just talk a second about where this goes for me is, how is somebody who's eating the standard American diet end up, you were just talking about the sucrose or the high fructose corn syrup, or there can be also agave in the processed food. So we have the fructose component, but something that you've talked about, not only in your books, but also in the research papers that I wanted to get to today, that is directly in line with what you paused for, is this idea of simultaneous excessive calories all arriving at the liver. So like in a standard American diet, maybe someone has got drinking some alcohol and then they're eating something that has sugar in it. And so can you just address for a minute uh, the issue of this the amount thing and the time frame in which all this stuff is arriving at the liver?
Yeah, sure. So the way, so when we discovered that fructose was very, very effective at, uh, you know, activating the survival switch, which I call the survival switch, we became interested in, why and how the fructose was doing this. And why would a sugar, fructose and glucose, look pretty similar? Why does this switch get turned on with fructose? And I'm going to get to answer your question, but I'm going to explain this first because it will allow me to answer the question. So fructose is distinct, even though it's chemically very similar to glucose. It's distinct in how it works. And most nutrients, if you eat food, you use it to generate calories, and the calories we generate are ATP, and so the calories are converted to a energy source called ATP, and that's how we function. We use the ATP to think, to drive, to walk, to talk. Everything we do is driven by ATP. That's the immediate usable energy. So when we eat food, we generate energy. If we get excess energy, we can store that energy as fat or glycogen, which is like starch in plants. And so it's the carbohydrate form of storage. And so we can either store energy or we can make energy that's immediately there to use, called ATP. And that's why we eat. You do that to get the energy that we need to live. And so normally the body maintains a very stable energy level. You want to keep the energy level pretty much at a quote normal level. And so when because we're continually expending energy, we'll eat food to generate the energy that we're expending, and maybe to have a small amount stored as fat. So for the rainy day kind of thing. So all nutrients produce energy, but there's a little bit of energy required to break down food. So when you eat food, you have to break it down, digest it, and then actually metabolize it. So you metabolize it to generate the energy. And there's energy required in digestion, and there's energy required in the metabolism of these molecules. And what almost all nutrients do is that when you're metabolizing it and you're actually burning a little energy to make energy, there's a careful feedback system that keeps the energy level at a normal level. So like with glucose, for example, it uses a little ATP to turn it into carbon dioxide and water. And that process of using ATP, there's sensors in the cell that kind of prevent the ATP levels from falling too low. And as a result, the ATP levels are maintained. But with fructose, there's no feedback for this. So if you eat a lot of fructose, you'll burn up a lot of ATP, and the ATP levels can fall in the cell. And that, along with the fall in phosphate that occurs with the ATP, triggers a series of reactions that are very unique and that generate the substance uric acid. And in that process, there's removal of the substrate to make more ATP. And so ATP levels actually stay low for it doesn't just dip, but it will tend to dip and come up a little bit and then stay low for a while. And so it stays below normal. And what we believe, based on our experimental data, we believe that this drop in ATP is one of the key signaling mechanisms saying to the animal, hey, we're having an energy crisis. We don't have enough energy on board. And so it makes the animal hungry. It makes the animal thirsty. It makes the animal and it activates processes to accumulate fat, to cause insulin resistance. And all these things are driven through biochemical pathways that can be linked with this central mechanism. So ATP levels aren't supposed to fall, but when they do and they stay low, it tells the organism it's in trouble. Now, what's unique is that normally when the ATP levels would fall, you would be starving, right? And it would be a bad situation. But in this situation, it's tricking the body into thinking it's starving. So when you eat like sugar and you eat that fructose, it drops the ATP, making the animal thinks it's starving, even though it may have a lot of fat, it may have a lot of other things on board already. Because inside the cell, the ATP levels are low, even though there's a lot of stored ATP in the fat. So what happens is it's like an alarm signal. It's like, help, Chicken Little, you think the sky is falling. Maybe it's not actually falling, but you think it is. And so what happens is you activate these processes. Now, your actual question is, how does this relate to sugar? And the interesting thing is the way the liver is kind of the central place where most of the sugar is metabolized. It's kind of it's like the center, it's like the capital in the body where everything's happening in terms of sugar metabolism. I mean, there's some sugar metabolism in the brain that's really important, and in the liver, in the kidney and other sites too. But the liver is the main guy that kind of drives obesity and insulin resistance and all that. And so when the liver sees the fructose, it metabolizes it right away. And so it's sort of like the concentration of fructose that drives the ATP level down. So if the concentration is high in the liver, then the ATP level will fall more. Well, interestingly, as Pete, you know chemistry well, concentration involves both amount and how much it accumulates, how rapidly it accumulates. So, for example, if I eat a small amount of fructose, the concentration is going to be low, even if I absorb it fast. But if I drink a small amount of fructose that's like a liquid fructose, and I'm doing it on an empty stomach, then the fructose may get absorbed more rapidly. And so the concentration the liver sees will be higher because it will all get there faster. And likewise, if I ate a large amount of fructose, but I ate it very slowly, I could keep the concentration levels in the liver small. So like if I had a soft drink and I just sipped it once every 10 minutes over a 4-hour period, even though there's sugar in it, a lot of sugar in it, a lot of fructose in it. If I just took one tiny sip and just did that slowly over hours, it would only be a calorie because we would never get the ATP depletion because the concentration that the liver sees would never be high enough to really drop the ATP level significantly. But if I took that same soft drink and got really hot and thirsty and I guzzled it down in 1 minute, then the concentration of fructose in the liver is going to be very high, and I'm going to get the ATP depletion, and I'm going to get the activation of the switch, and all the bad things are going to go on. So based on that, we posited that liquid drinks, soft drinks, are different from solid sugar, because with soft drinks you tend to drink it fast, and it gets absorbed rapidly. So there actually was a study done where people took jelly beans that were rich in sugar, and they gave the same amount of sugar as in a soft drink. And they did these experiments, and they could show that the soft drinks activated this switch much more than the jelly beans. So it's not just about the amount of sugar, but how rapidly you eat it. And so if you, there's, if you go to the literature, people say, oh, it's been long thought that if you ate slowly, that actually reduces your risk for obesity. I remember hearing about this when I was a kid. Don't eat your food real fast or you'll get fat. There actually is a science to this, and all the studies have epidemiology suggests that liquid sugar is worse than solid sugar, and you can show this in our animals. If we want to get them fat, we give them really quickly. We put the sugar in the water, or the fructose in the water, because they drink it fast and they get the high concentration. So yes, and of course that also generates more uric acid.
But I want to ask you to clarify, because is this correct? We could switch the soda, the bottle of soda or the can of soda, with an 8-ounce glass of fruit juice.
Yes, fruit juice. This is why, yeah. So let's talk about fruit and fruit juice, because this actually helps explain this better. So, animals will eat fruit to get fat. And in the fall, many animals will eat fruit to help them store fat and to activate the switch. Orangutans will eat huge amounts of fruit at a setting. They'll find these fruiting trees where all the trees are, it's called masting, when there's synchronized fruiting, and they will just gorge on fruit for days and days and accumulate enough fat to survive the year, because there's times in the year when food is sparse for them. And the same is true for animals preparing for hibernation, or birds that are preparing for long distance migration. And so they can use fruit to gain fat. And so the question is, what about fruits for us? And the first thing is to realize that we often eat like 1 or 2 fruits at a time. We don't tend to eat 20 fruits, 20 bananas at one setting. So a banana may have 6 grams or so of fructose. That's actually a fair amount of fructose, but like a soft drink will have like 25 grams or so of fructose. There's a huge difference. And many fruits have only 2 to 4 grams of fructose. So if you just eat, a serving of fruit, first off, you're not getting that much fructose. Secondly, the fruit that we eat tends to be tart. And when we eat fruit, it's very important to know that as a fruit matures, its sweetness goes up. So when it falls out from a tree, it's often ripe and the sugar content is like at its maximum. But we tend to eat it when it's when it's not super ripe. We prefer tart fruits in general. And so the sugar content's a little bit less. And as a fruit ripens, vitamin C levels fall. So vitamin C is in fruit. And vitamin C turns out to be a natural inhibitor of the switch. It's not enough by itself. With all the sugar we're eating, it's not going to block it fully, but it does have an effect. And eating taking 500 milligrams of vitamin C a day is a very good move for everybody, not for all aspects of health, frankly. And we've done studies on it. But anyway, but fruit has vitamin C in it, and so and especially tart fruit, and that helps neutralize the effects of sugar. And then there are other things in fruit, like fiber, that slow the absorption of fruit, and like potassium, which actually counters some of the effects as well. And there are other components, what we call flavonols and epicatechin, and all kinds of good things in fruit. So a lot of them are neutralizing some of the fructose. But as the fruit ripens, these components often decrease. And if you make juice where you're getting rid of the fiber and you're adding multiple fruit, now you have like 20 grams of sugar instead of 4 grams because you put 4 fruit in there. or 5 fruit. And then when you drink it, you're also drinking it fast. And so it's not surprising that fruit juice has been linked with obesity in children. And in the pediatric societies say, hey, you have to limit your fruit juice because it can cause obesity and in children. And also, and it probably does in adults as well. And fruit juice is not recommended unless you have very small amounts, and then you should probably not down it in one gulp.
Okay, so you've used the term switch now a few times, and that I probably should have thought of doing my questioning in a way to bring you there more carefully. So I apologize for that. But could you talk about what the switch is for the our listeners who we might have already lost, right? And the switch aspect of your work is so super important to understanding what's going on.
Sure. Yeah. So when we were first studying animals and giving them sugar or fructose, we found that not only they became obese, but they also accumulated fat in their liver and fat in their blood, and their blood pressure went up, and they developed what we call, and they became insulin resistant, and they developed what we call metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is this group of symptom of signs, and they're all about storing fat. So if you can store fat in your fat tissue, that's a survival response. If you can store fat in your liver, that's another main site, and you store it in your blood, triglycerides. So it's all about trying to hold on to fat, become insulin resistant, and raise your blood pressure. That's a good thing in the survival setting because you want to have enough support of the circulation to go out there even when you might be starving. As we studied it more, we found other things that were linked with this. For example, like a low-grade inflammation, we found changes in behavior, foraging. So the foraging is really a survival response, and it really is a specific behavior. You have to be able to go into areas that you've not been before. So there's a certain amount of novelty seeking, risk taking. You can't deliberate very much on anything because you've got to make quick decisions. And we were able to kind of link all these things together and show them in different ways that this switch is actually, you turn on a system that really is aimed at trying to survive. And then what we did is we found that in animals in the wild, for example, they turn these behaviors on, but then they suddenly stop eating and they switch to a fat burning phase. And it's like a switch. Suddenly they go on, they get fat, then they turn it off and they burn the fat. And you can actually show that change actually occurs before they actually hibernate. There's this shift in the week before where suddenly they quit eating and so forth. And they go into this fat burning phase. And the hibernation actually occurs a few days after the phase begins. And interestingly, when an animal hibernates, if you wake it up and you offer it food, it won't eat. It doesn't care about food at that point. It won't want it. So it's like a real behavioral change. And so we were wondering, what turns on and off this switch. And we came to the conclusion that in humans, what we're doing is we're keep activating this switch. We just have turned it on where we keep accumulating the fat. Hibernation is yet to come. And so we're getting bigger and bigger. And so this is what I mean by the switch, that we turn this on. And when it becomes on for a long time, what happens is that insulin resistance progresses to diabetes. That elevation in blood pressure progresses to high blood pressure. The fatty liver progresses to liver disease and cirrhosis. The inflammation leads to an increased risk for heart disease. The foraging turns into behavioral disorders like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a foraging response, basically. Mania has been linked with this, and even aggressive behaviors. And what we found is too is that if this pathway is activated in the brain, I'm talking about mainly in the liver now, but if you activate it in the brain, it mimics all the characteristics of Alzheimer's. And so we think that it actually has a role in that disease. So we think that nature, instinctively wanted us to protect ourselves, and they developed this ingenious protective system where you could store all of the fat in preparation for a crisis, because it's so much better to store fat before the crisis occurs than after the crisis occurs. But the problem is, and so it generated all these systems to do this. And the problem is that as we've gotten better at living and getting agriculture and food products, and what's happened is we can get these foods that trigger the switch, and what's happening is we go into override, and this survival system becomes the cause of most of the current day's diseases. So it has a huge impact. When you look at the list of diseases that are, we think, driven by this, it's major. It's major league.
I want to ask you to talk about uric acid, because in what I've learned from everything that I've read of your work in the books or whatever, the uric acid, I want to ask you to talk about that, its relationship to the mitochondria, and how that is driving insulin resistance, whether do you even agree with that statement?
Yeah, I do agree with that statement. And so just briefly, uric acid is a substance that we generate when we break down DNA and RNA or even ATP. And it's a breakdown product, and then we excrete it in our urine and a little bit in our intestines. And so we keep our blood levels at a certain level. And what's happened is, as we eat more sugar in Western foods and beer and alcohol, we can raise our uric acid levels. And so there's some people in this country, 20 million in the US, that have what we would call hyperuricemia, or high uric acid levels. And about 9 million people, nine of those 20 million, 9 additional million, have gout. And gout is the classic disease of a high uric acid. And it's due to the uric acid crystallizing typically in the joints. And when it does, like in the big toe, it causes pain. And it is a horrible, awful pain. The good news is it responds pretty quickly to anti-inflammatories. And so a lot of people don't really view gout as being that serious a problem, because it's serious when they get it, but they can treat it pretty quickly. And so uric acid is generated from alcohol, and it's generated from eating purine foods. These are kind of rich meats and gravies and things like that. Brewer's yeast used in beer is a very rich source of purines, and so they can generate uric acid. And so the classic teaching for years was, eat low purine foods and reduce your alcohol intake. But it was recognized much more in the last 10 years that sugar is also a major precipitator of gout, and it's because of the fructose. And so high fructose corn syrup and fructose can also trigger an attack. And as we mentioned, when fructose is metabolized, it actually generates uric acid, and so it increases the risk for gout. Now, many people have thought that uric acid was really only a problem when it was in a crystalline form, so that if you had a high uric acid level but you didn't have gout, don't worry about it. And it still remains a controversial topic. But work by our group has suggested that uric acid is doing a lot of things that are not good. biologically active. And it can be biologically active either as a crystal or in the soluble form. And what we've recently has been discovered that uric acid crystals don't just go to the joints, but that they can go to the plaque and the coronary arteries, and they can go in the aorta and in the kidney in multiple sites. So there's this thought that uric crystals could be doing more than just a gout attack. And there's also some evidence that those crystals can persist even in people who are not actively having gout. So this has really been a shakeup. And then our group has also looked at soluble uric acid and looked at what it does. Excuse me. And it's one second. It's pro-inflammatory. So when you put uric acid on cells, it actually stimulates some inflammation. And we've looked at the way it does it. And in association with the inflammation, the uric acid also goes into the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is where ATP is made. And it causes oxidative stress to the mitochondria. And oxidative stress is this really bad thing where oxygen can actually become reactive and activate a lot of biologic processes that aren't so good. And one of the issues when you get oxidative stress in the mitochondria is it dampens the ability of the mitochondria to function. And so they don't produce as much ATP. And so that's one of the reasons that this uric fructose causes the ATP levels to fall and tend to stay lower, because the oxidative stress is in the mitochondria is dampening the mitochondria. And we think that turns out to be important in how the switch is activated, so that uric acid is an accomplice. Fructose is doing a lot, but uric acid is a true accomplice.
So I'm trying to push you here to the issue of insulin resistance. So basically, the fructose uric acid model, it's driving. Would you say that it's driving insulin resistance? Can we make a bold statement like that?
Yes, I think we can. Now, we haven't specifically proven how the uric acid causes the insulin resistance. We've shown that lowering uric acid can prevent insulin resistance in a lot of animal models. And mitochondrial oxidative stress has been definitely linked as a key mechanism to cause diabetes, and uric acid causes mitochondrial oxidative stress. So a lot of the components are there. And fructose has been shown to cause insulin resistance, and we can dampen the insulin resistance from fructose by lowering uric acid. So we know that uric acid is involved in driving the insulin resistance. The specific biologic pathway, we know it likely involves AKT, which is the signaling pathway, but we don't absolutely know how it does it. We can show that uric acid can blunt the effect of an endothelial cell to respond to insulin. So normally when you put insulin on an endothelial cell, it will produce nitric oxide. That allows the blood vessels to dilate to help get the glucose to the muscle, and uric acid inhibits that response. And so it blocks the insulin response in the endothelium. So that's partially one of the reasons, but it's more complicated than that for sure.
Yeah, no, I realize this is like a needle in a haystack thing, which is one of the reasons I really appreciate your work, because I think that we actually got inside the haystack a little bit further than I thought. Now, in terms of gout, what I did was I looked at your work. When I first started with Lustig's papers, right? And that led me to you. And then I got into your work, and I realized as I was reading that this can explain gout, because I had already realized in my own, with my own experience with gout, that when you look at the amount of people walking around with hyperuricemia and the fact that many of them have crystals in joints, but they don't have gout, I'm like, this can't just be a question of a crystal that's irritating a joint. Because, oh, and the other thing I should mention to you is that when I was reversing my prediabetes, I've been religiously also monitoring my biomarkers, glucose, ketones, and uric acid with a handheld meter every single day, right? And in that process, there were times when my uric acid was over 10. There was one time when it was 12 mgs per deciliter. And I'm going, geez, if it's just the crystal and an inflammation thing, I'm a walking, talking gout attack right now, but it wasn't happening, right? So I'm going, okay, so what's going on? And that's what led me to think, well, this has to do maybe with the intracellular rapid acute rise that you guys talk about in the uric acid stimulating this inflammation cascade, and then other pieces of the needle in the haystack coming together in the right way within the joint in order to have the attack.
Yeah. So, a very fascinating thing is what you're saying about gout is that what causes the crystallization is more complicated than just the serum uric acid.
Right.
So there are people who have had attacks of gout where their serum uric acid levels have been chronically in the normal range. And so there are cases of gout occurring with uric acids of like less than 6. Or likewise, you can have a uric acid of 10. And if they do special imaging called DEC imaging, where they can actually see urate crystals, there are many people who don't have any crystals despite having the high uric acid. So the serum uric acid correlates, but is not by itself the sole cause.
Right.
It's a contributor, because the higher the serum uric acid, the higher the risk for gout. So there is a direct relationship. But you can have a very high uric acid level without gout, and you can have a low uric acid level, or normal uric acid level, I should say, with gout. And so that there are different factors driving crystallization above and beyond the serum uric acid. And the inflammatory response to the soluble uric acid could be playing a role, the intracellular effects and so forth. And we also know, remember that uric acid, drives inflammation, but there are things that counter inflammation. So, for example, if you have other reasons that may counter inflammation, like elevated ketones, or like some kind of anti-inflammatory pathway, high levels of vitamin C, or foods or nutrients, or very good vascular function, they may counter the negative effects of the uric acid to keep you in balance. Uric acid is a risk factor. It makes you try to turn on things to be inflammatory, but you can counter it.
Do you think, here's a question that I'm getting a lot of, right? Because I've really turned my focus to trying to help people with this. And I was going to tell you, you're talking to one of the guys right now. I just went on allopurinol. That's what I'm going to ask you about in June, right? And then I had a gout flare, and my uric acid was 4.5 mgs per deciliter, right? And I measured it. I was measuring it every day anyway. And then when I started the allopurinol, and then when I had the gout flare, I measured it, like I was measuring it all day long at different times. And so I had normal uric acid as far as the reference range went, and I still had a gout flare. But as you just pointed out, I'm really religious about my ketogenic diet. And so my ketones were, at that point, my average was 1.0, right? And so I had the beta hydroxybutyrate there to tamp down on the inflammatory response. So that flare actually was not bad by any stretch of the imagination, right? Most people with the gout are going to tell you it's a 10. And in the ketogenic diet, with that flare that just happened to me. Now, I haven't had any symptoms since then, but it was a 1 or a 2. You know what I'm saying? It was very, very different.
Very interesting. Yeah. So although I've studied uric acid for years and almost in multiple systems and so forth, I have to confess that I still have a lot to learn. And I enjoy research for that reason, because we're always trying to figure out more about how things work. But for sure, I think that it is a biologically active molecule, and we just need to continue to study it more and get a better idea of how critical it is in these different conditions.
With that, we're at 50 minutes now, and I want to be super respectful of your time. So I want to give Scott a chance to ask a question if he would like, and then we can close out after that if you want. But this has just been amazing. I have this whole list, and we're nowhere close, but this has been really, really great. Scott, what do you got for us?
Hi, gents. Hi. Good to meet you, Dr. Johnson.
Nice to meet
Fascinating
you, too.
discussion. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a chemistry professor like Dr. Pete. We crossed paths because we were both in the Verta program. So I'm someone who had type 2 diabetes. I'm happy to say I reversed it without medication and just using, eating the right food, low carb, obviously.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in the macro view, all this wonderful research you're doing. If you were to talk to someone like myself, who I still have more to go in my journey in terms of metabolic healing, I still have weight I want to take off. I still have some challenges. The blood pressure is a little bit high. So how would you apply your research and this information to advising a patient like me to, further their metabolic healing? What would they eat? What would their supplements be?
Well, it's a big question. I do go into detail in my book, my new book, but I can kind of just summarize some of the key rules. The first one is, obviously try to avoid, liquid sugar. I mean, that is just by far the most easiest way. So high fructose corn syrup and sugar in fluids like soft drinks, fruit juices, just cut them out. And then when it comes to general diets, you're right, a low carb diet is really important. It turns out that salt, very salty foods, also turns on fructose production in the body, and over time can cause obesity as well. And so you don't want to eat really salty foods, or just occasionally. Very heavy purine-rich foods can also do it, what we call umami foods. You have to be careful with some of them, like beer, which has that yeast, which is very rich in purines. And things like shrimp. And then you need to exercise to restore the mitochondria, because over time, sugar knocks the mitochondria down permanently. So initially, it just knocks it down for a while. And then when you're not eating the sugar, the mitochondria come back up. But over time, the chronic oxidative stress to the mitochondria causes these to actually decrease. And when that happens, you kind of get locked into your weight. And so you think you can do all the dieting you want, but it's hard to lose weight. And the only trick there is what you should consider doing is you should exercise what we call zone 2 exercise, where you want to be walking where your heart rate goes up a bit, but not to the point where you can't talk. So if you're exercising and you can't talk, you're going too hard. If you're able to continue to talk while you're exercising, but it's a little hard, you're right at the right spot. And that's what we call zone 2 exercise. And that will helps restore the mitochondria. but it can take, most studies suggest you have to do at least 40 minutes or so of exercise to really get that benefit during the exercise. So unfortunately, the 15-minute exercise isn't good. So like walking fast or cycling, those can help. Taking vitamin C, we mentioned that. Dark chocolate actually can be beneficial to the mitochondria. Green tea, things like that. Those are good because you want to restore those. And that's really the trick. So you want to block the damage. So you have to eat the right foods. And then you want to restore what's been damaged. And that often involves some kind of exercise program. But it's really, congratulations to you, Scott. I mean, it's just fantastic that you got the diabetes to go away by eating the right foods. And I'm proud of you because it's not an easy thing. I mean, a lot of these foods are quite addicting, and it's very, very difficult to carb restrict, chronically. And you're doing great. And I would just probably add the exercise piece, the type of exercise. And I do encourage you to read my book because there's a lot more to it than that. But I think drinking a lot of water, for example, helps.
Just a super fast follow-up, or did the clock run out? Just real quick.
No, you're good.
If you looked into your crystal ball and looked at the really rich areas of research and medical technology where everything's going, and you had to say, this is just a really fertile area where I think there's going to be breakthroughs, and we're actually going to use the C word, cure, in the not too distant future, what would you point to?
Well, we and others are trying to develop drugs to actually block fructose, the drop in energy that occurs with fructose. And when we do that, animals can eat all the sugar they want, and they don't get fat. And so we already there are a number of large pharma that are actively working on this. The treatment lowers uric acid. As a full disclosure, I have a small biotech company. It's very small. It's mainly scientists, and we're trying to make inhibitors as well. So I think that there is the possibility of natural products as well that might be able to interfere with this pathway. And supplements type thing. And so there's a lot of interest in this. That's one area. I think also once we understand the biology better, people will be able to make food safer. And I do think that I believe that these big epidemics that are going on now will not be significant 30 years from now. I think diabetes is going to be back down to under 2% of the population by then.
Wow.
In terms of, especially for people developing it. So I believe we're going to be in a good stead. That's my prediction.
Thank you for that.
You bet.
All right, Dr. Johnson, I'd really like to thank you for your time. This has really been fantastic, and I hope we can continue to correspond. And I love your new book. So for anyone listening, I ordered a pre-advanced copy on Amazon, and it's called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. It's fantastic. Also, the Fat Switch is equally as good. I hadn't had a chance yet to read the Sugar Fix, but those are fantastic books. In any case, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Pete.
And hopefully,
thank you, Scott.
Yes, thank you, Scott. Those were great questions. And we'll see you next time. And everybody remember, keep the carbs low. Down the road we go.
Right. Thank you.